Now, when James Watt invented and revolutionized the steam turbine engine, there was massive fear, huge pushback for all the same reasons we're seeing right now around AI. Now, his genius move that got people to be somewhat open to these new steam turbine engines he'd invented was to use a frame of reference that was familiar. So, for instance, he talked about them in terms of their horsepower. Now you wonder, like, why do we, like, a SpaceX rocket goes into space with 300,000 horsepower? Like, what a stupid number to use. Why do we refer to things as horsepower? It goes back to James Watt, because when he was trying to sell the idea of this, people are like, okay, well, I've only got one horse, but this machine's 8 horsepower. Like that, okay, cool. It freaks me out a bit, but at least I'm open to it because I can see it's a frame of reference I see as familiar and valuable. I can make sense of that.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced and executive leaders to build community, grow capability and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. When I think about the conversations that really stay with us, it's often the ones where someone manages to take what feels uncertain and overwhelming and helps us see what the opportunity in it is. And that is exactly what Michael McQueen does. He is one of the world's leading futurists, and he has a way of explaining our rapidly changing world that makes you lean in rather than panic. I still remember hearing him speak years ago about artificial intelligence, back when most of the room thought it was little more than science fiction. Fast forward to today, and the generative AI boom has transformed our work and our lives faster than even Michael predicted. It's upending industries built on billable hours, raising questions about value and credibility, and forcing leaders to rethink what actually makes them relevant. But here's the thing that excites Michael the most. AI isn't coming for our humanity. In fact, it highlights what makes us irreplaceable. We're moving from jobs of muscle to jobs of the brain to jobs of the heart. Empathy, intuition, creativity, these are the leadership qualities that no algorithm can replace. Michael also points out something fascinating about generational shifts. For the first time, we're seeing a generation, which is Gen Z, not rushing to climb the ladder into leadership. They've watched older generations work themselves to the bone, and they're choosing balance, flexibility, and purpose over titles and the corner offices. That shift has huge implications for how we think about cultivating leaders of the future. And then there's the way we work. Offices have become destinations rather than duties, and culture is no longer something you can write into a handbook. It's caught, not taught, which means if you're not creating real opportunities for people to connect and build trust face to face, you're missing the mortar that holds the bricks of your organisation together. At the centre of all of this, Michael believes a future fit leader needs 3 things: confidence, conviction, and curiosity. Confidence to back yourself, conviction to know what you stand for, and curiosity to keep learning and unlearning as the world shifts around you. Without those 3 working in harmony, we risk becoming either rigid, flaky, or paralysed. This is a conversation that challenges, reassures, and energizes all at once. So here is the brilliant Michael McQueen helping us see the future not as something to fear, but as something that we can lean into with heart, wisdom, and leadership. Hello, Michael. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
We were talking offline and we were saying how you and I first connected with a conference in Fiji where you gave a wonderful presentation about what the future was going to look like in terms of business and a whole range of things. And I was actually trying to find my old notes the other day to say, I wonder how much of that we actually took notice of at the time. Couldn't find
I'd be
it.
very
So
impressed if you found your notes. I often think that, like, people take all these notes at conferences and like, where do they all go? I don't think many of them actually ever see the light of day again. But it is funny, isn't it? When I look back at some of those conferences, I would have those like slides somewhere in
You
my
would.
computer. When I think back to the stuff that was changing, obviously some of it has happened and in fact happened faster than we thought it would. Like I talked a lot about AI at the time, and I do remember there are a bunch of people in the room who were just like, oh, artificial intelligence, like what is that really? And is it like Skynet, robots, Terminator stuff? Whereas I think the business case, I was trying to talk about how this works, how this will impact industries, and there were a whole lot of blank expressions. What none of us saw coming, of course, was the generative AI push. That has happened so much faster than even I would have predicted at that point. Because at that stage, I talked a bit about chatbots, but they were those, those super awkward ones when you'd ring a call center and the chatbot would try and answer your questions and it would be useless. You'd be like, can I just talk to a human? Like that was sort of where it was at. And it was so clunky, but yeah, it's come ahead quickly in the last few years.
If we'd known about the AI that's in place today, we would have bought the shares a lot earlier.
Oh my goodness.
than
Yes.
we probably have done. But anyway, so Michael, what are some of the trends that you see shaping the leadership of work? And there's been such a shift and change. We put a marker on COVID. And I know we do that a lot, but there's been such a shift and change. What are some of the trends that you're starting to see shape what the future of leadership looks like?
Well, I read something interesting last week, and I'll be curious to see how this particular trend plays out. And it was talking about the lack of desire for Gen Zs to want to move into leadership, which was interesting. We've heard
that's
this
interesting
assumption for years, that like every generation coming through as a function of life stage and career stage has their eye on the next thing, moving up the ladder, being apprenticed, mentored by someone who's a few steps ahead of them, and they're moving into those leadership roles. And yet this study was a fairly wide-ranging study. It was mainly in the US and a bit in Europe in terms of the data points, but it was looking at how many Gen Zs like, we're just not excited about moving into leadership. We don't.
Did it say why? Did they say why?
It didn't give a whole lot of clear answers yet. It was only a very early study that had just come out. I mean, there was a whole lot of theories as to why. The whole theme of work-life balance. So a generation who've seen the generation before them, essentially work their backsides off. They're like, we're just not willing to do that. And we saw that start with Gen Y. And I saw that in some of the key markets I'd be working in, particularly around Asia, where the generation gap was so wide because you've got the parents' generation looking at their sons and daughters, but especially sons in places like Japan, for instance. And that focus on work ethic and climbing the ladder and getting credentialed was so strong and such a part of your personal identity as a culture. And younger generations like, oh, we're just not interested. This is a number of years ago with millennials. And we're seeing that perhaps even more so now with Generation Z. So I think that's going to be an interesting trend to watch. The big one that I think how we've seen accelerated because of the pandemic was this pulling down of facades around leadership. When we all went to work remotely, well, those wonderful moments when like the cat would walk in front of the camera during an all hands meeting with all the staff. And at first, leaders were horrified. This idea of, gosh, everyone's going to think I'm lacking in credibility if I seem to be too casual, not formal enough. And yet actually it was the opposite. What that built was trust, this idea that you're just a real person. And we've seen even that play out in practical and symbolic ways. Like you walk around the CBD of most areas, not just in Australia, but worldwide, most Western countries, I would not have seen a tie being used in an office for a long while. Like you have some people who wear ties, but dress codes have become a lot more relaxed. So I think those sort of trends around that, this breaking down of some of those symbols of status and power. And then, certainly generational change is a big one. The one that I'm sure we'll talk about, so we won't go there too quickly, is AI, what that means for the workplace, what that means for talent. What I'm finding for professional services firms right now is how do you charge your clients? What's the value proposition when you're so used to charging by billable hours for accountants, law firms, consultancies? Now AI is making some of that stuff really efficient. In fact, there's now almost a tacit expectation you'd be using AI from a client value perspective. If you're not, it's like, well, why aren't you using these tools? And then where's the value exchange really at for clients? And the same thing for leaders. If you can use AI to do a whole bunch of the stuff that in the past made you look credible and authoritative as a leader, does that erode some of that source of credibility? So those are some of the big things I'm watching right now.
It's interesting points you make, particularly on the AI increasing our efficiencies, reducing time that we take to do anything. How does that impact the cost that we then charge back to the client.
Yep.
Does that
Yeah.
actually increase the cost, or does that decrease it? And the client will be expecting to decrease it, but then you're making the investment in the technology from the business
Yeah.
perspective, and
Yep.
that's not cheap,
Yeah.
So
Well, and it's interesting
interesting
too how it's
dilemma.
changing the way we engage with information as well. Like, I mean, for instance, so take that article I was talking about reading 2 weeks back about Gen Z not being interested in leadership. So I read probably the first third of the article, which was like the headline data piece. What was the study? What was the methodology? I suspect it then got into the weeds and talked about why and some of the key drivers, and probably had a few like anecdotal stories from people they'd surveyed. I didn't get that far because what I did, like a lot of us do, is I read, I thought, this is interesting, this is timely, this is relevant. I'm going to put a post up on LinkedIn for this. So I went into Buffer, which I use to schedule all my content online, and I used ChatGPT to write the post. So no M dashes, conversational in the tone of Michael McQueen, write a LinkedIn post. And so I read some of it, but I didn't read the whole thing. And so then when you ask, well, why are some of the reasons? I'm like, it's a great question. I didn't get that far. And I think that's what we're doing.
At least
so
you're honest.
but I think we all are. This idea of we're using these tools to synthesize data so well, but it's making knowledge very superficial. And I'm noticing within myself, my velocity is much greater. I can do much more, but it's at a lower depth. Like I forced myself yesterday to read. There was a McKinsey piece that came out yesterday about forecasting the impact of generative AI on industry revenue models and stuff. And it was a bit dry, but I'm like, I'm just going to force myself to sit and read the whole thing, because I'm finding it so tempting now not to. And you just skim and you just share all the stuff that we're bouncing around online, but not engaging deeply. I think I'm seeing the same thing starting to happen in clients, in organizations. And it's only a matter of time before you trip up. You miss details. We've got to be very mindful of this. I mean, even last week, and I won't share the name of the colleague, but a colleague was using a title for a keynote. And I really respect this particular colleague. I've known him for years, but he basically had like pinched one of my book titles as the title for his keynote.
No.
And someone else in the audience saw it and took a photo and said, hey, do you know that this is going on? I'm like, I know this person well enough to know they wouldn't do this on purpose. And so I just messaged him and said, hey, just so you know, that's like one of the titles of one of my books and also one of the keynotes that I'm typically delivering a lot. Just like the world's, it's a small market, just to be aware of, confusion and stuff. Wanted to be really sort of just gentle in my approach, not be all accusatory and cruel. And he came back and said, oh, I'm so sorry. Actually, I had to put this presentation together fast. And so for titles, I used generative AI. And so I went with what came back with, which was really good. I should have gone the next step and then checked, is that being used elsewhere? I just didn't. And I think those are the things we're seeing happen increasingly. The stakes are high.
Let's go to the AI conversation while we're here.
Why not?
You talk about that AI is coming for tasks, but not necessarily jobs. What is the leadership opportunity around this shift?
Yeah. I think what we are seeing already is that it's putting a highlighter over the things that are uniquely human and are highly valuable. So the more we can allow AI to free up people to do the people stuff, the better. One of the things I think is a bit sad when I see individuals and organizations using AI to do the creative stuff. I'm like, leave that for the humans. That's what we do really well. And you're like, I was reading an article this morning, in fact, and it was like the image next to the article, and it was in like an HR trade journal thing that I read every day. I am 100% sure this image was AI generated headshot. I'm like, dude, just put up a photo of yourself. I just use a real photo taken by a real photographer that just, like, what we're using it to do the creative things. Whereas I think what it's really good at is crunching data sets, drawing broad insights that you can then use human intuition and judgment to then draw wisdom from. Because like we're in the wisdom economy, not the knowledge economy now. And I think that's an important distinction. Like the wisdom piece is what humans do, because we can essentially draw insights and inferences across multiple frames really quickly, and a lot of it is gut and intuitive led. We like to discount intuition, but it's such a big part of what makes a human decision a human decision. And we all know those moments where like all the data stacked up, but in your gut you knew something wasn't right, and so you stopped, you paused. And from a leadership perspective, how important that instinct is. And so we can't overlook that. So make allowances and space and time for the human stuff. Let AI do the things that AI does brilliantly, but let's allow humans, and let's allow that to free humans up to do the human things. And this beautiful quote I read years ago, probably 3 years ago now, from Manoush Shafiq. If you haven't heard of her, she's really, really worth following. So she used to be the head of the London School of Economics, then went over to be president at Columbia University. All the political stuff got messy. She got sort of shafted from that role. I don't know what she's doing at the moment, but she's a really insightful woman. And her quote was, in the past, Jobs are about muscle, being able to physically do things, lift and lug and shift stuff. Now jobs are about your brain, how smart you are, your cognitive capacity. So in the future, jobs are going to be about heart. And so that ability to bring your full human self, like intuition, empathy, caring, deep creativity, that's the stuff that's going to set us apart. And so for any leader, it's like, how do you see that stuff flourish in your organization? Let AI do all the number crunching and all the transactional stuff.
And you're so right, because the AI doesn't have any heart.
No.
It doesn't have the emotion, it doesn't have the empathy, it doesn't have the human understanding. And quite often, no matter what you produce on ChatGPT, you have to go and put the heart piece in it, whether it's the blog or whether it's, whatever it is.
Yep.
How are you seeing industries take it up? We talk about how this is the fastest time at the moment, but it's also the slowest time. And that kind of go, how does that even work? But that is the case. In your experience, are industries taking up these options and opportunities led by, leaders who are at the forefront of this? Are we taking all of these changes up fast enough? Because the reality is none of us like change.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's put a pin in that not liking change piece, because that's interesting. And that's the last few years, that's been the crux of my sort of non-techie research, the psychology of change. Really interesting, because a lot of what we've thought for years is actually not true around that, like why people resist change. So we can come back to that. But in terms of industries that are using this well, there are so many that I could look at, but one that's front of mind, because I did a segment on Sunrise Saturday about this. I had just put all the content together 2 days ago for it, so it's front of mind. So recruitment and HR is interesting for a couple of reasons. And it's one that most of us, it touches our lives at some point, because you're applying for a job, you've got a son or a daughter you've got friends who are going for jobs, or maybe you're doing the hiring, you bring people onto a team. That whole process is radically changing because of AI. So 2/3 of businesses already are using some form of AI for hiring. And so the two main ways it's being used is for candidate screening. So we're seeing AI tools, like HireVue, for instance, that will scan tens, hundreds, thousands of applications for a role and be, identifying, is it a good fit or not good, as a first screening point? Are they in or are they out? Then you've even got examples where AI bots are doing the interviews themselves. So
online.
Yeah. So either online or in chat form. So one that I laughed when I saw it's called, Chipotle over in the US, the restaurant chain, they've got one called Avocado, of course, is their bot that does interviews. And so that's a pre-screening tool, the first sort of line of screening for job applications. And so I'm seeing lots of discussions, even on Reddit. I was reading some posts in prep for this Sunrise thing, about people who'd gone on to do an interview and they just had a hunch that it wasn't a person, because it all just sounded a little bit too sanitized.
How do you know? So how do you test for that? How do I test if you're not a bot right now? Or an AI version of yourself?
Well, there's actually, at the moment, if you look at it from an Aussie context, we in Australia don't have any legal requirement for companies to notify you if you're speaking to a bot, which is crazy. That's a loophole that will be closed and needs to be closed pretty quickly, just to let you know that you're not speaking to a human. But there are some tells, some giveaways, but it is tricky, and it's getting trickier because the tech is getting so good. I was seeing a colleague post something last week. He used HeyGen, which is one of these tools where you can create an avatar of yourself, and it speaks in 80 something different languages. And it is so intuitive. To see this HeyGen avatar of him being interviewed and speaking to people, it's remarkable how lifelike it is. Now, it's not exactly right. If you know the person, you can tell if it's not exactly them. But this is getting trickier. In fact, there was an example a few months ago that, in terms of the dangers of this from a leadership standpoint, and whenever I work with risk people, chief risk officers, they all start sweating when I tell this story. So this is an example in Hong Kong of an employee who was working in a finance function role. They had a bunch of people on a call like this. It was either Teams or Zoom, a series of colleagues on this call to make a bunch of decisions. One of the people on the call was the global CFO of this business based in London. So that's this individual in Hong Kong's boss's 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 boss. So as part of the conversation, the authorization is given to make a series of transactions totaling about 25 million bucks over a period of time. And so this employee in Hong Kong did it, because when your boss's boss's boss says to do something, you do. So they did. A few days later, they get a call from the global CFO, because all of the transactions had the CFO's name as the authorizing party. CFO calls out, what are these transactions about? At that point, the penny drops. They realized, they did some digging, discovered every person on that Zoom call or that Teams call had been a deep fake. Not the
No.
people. And these are people this individual in Hong Kong had worked with its colleagues for years. They knew them really well. And so these are some of the things that I'm seeing leaders grappling with right now, because it is increasingly difficult to figure out what's real and what's not, which, going back to where we started the conversation with, it really underscores why just being real,
Human to human
just
connection
being
is so important.
letting your guard down and being unvarnished at times, and just stuffing up and having things go wrong are those brilliant moments where suddenly people are real. If you look at the neuroscience, what happens when those things occur, oxytocin is released. That's their social bonding trust hormone. If we talk about the trust crisis in businesses today, why do people not feel trust? Well, because their leaders, the people that are hoping to build trust with them, are two-dimensional. There's nothing real about them. And so I think, again, in an age of AI, that even elevates the importance of taking steps to build that sense of trust and authenticity.
So talking about that,
Yeah.
and we'll come to the change piece next,
Yeah.
but talking about that, you look at how much the world of work has changed. So you've got a hybrid world of work. You've been quoted by saying the office is becoming a destination rather than a duty. So,
Yeah.
I'd be at my office from 8:30 to 5:30, then I'd go home, and that was my life every day. But today I
Yeah.
can choose to work in an office. I can choose to work from home. I can choose to work from a cafe. I can choose to work from a we workspace,
Yeah. Yep.
from the beach. Does anyone really know where I am?
Yeah.
So how do organizations then ensure that, well, a couple of things, the change piece is managed, the trust piece is managed, and then if we look, a few years down the future, ensure that it's not a generative AI that's actually sitting there in the meeting talking to me, and the
Yeah.
real me is on a beach having a
Yep.
holiday.
Yeah. So that's already happening. You can actually set up an avatar of yourself within Teams that will attend meetings and look like you and nod and react.
I
There are
didn't know that. I'm going to go
it's
and set one up.
it's a little bit clunky, but like it's there. The idea being you can have your camera off, but your avatar attends the meeting on your behalf, and so it looks like your camera's on. I think what these things do go to show, though, is the importance of creating spaces and opportunities where you are physically together. And so you might find you've got a distributed team where everyone's working in different locations, but to be together, I don't know, once a month, once every 3 weeks, and a good chunk of that time isn't about achieving outcomes, because you can do all the meetings remotely. People can do their deep work, Cal Newport style stuff remotely. When you're together, what's the value of being together? Relationships, social stuff, getting to know each other, getting to like and trust each other. And these are the things that matter more than ever, because it's like the mortar between the bricks. And this is where early on, I flinched at some of the commentary during lockdowns when people said, see, this whole remote work thing is working so well. Well, we'll never need to go back to physically working together ever again. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm pretty sure. I remember like getting a bit of flack for this, but saying, I actually think as soon as lockdown's finished and we can be back in the office, there'll be a portion of the time where we are physically back together, and we need to be. For all sorts of reasons. One of the things that I pushed back at all the data around productivity. Like how productive people are when they're working remotely. People were terrified of losing their jobs. Like we were staring down the barrel of essentially the next Great Depression. So you had very warped data of people going, gosh, I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep my job because the world's falling apart. So people were ultra productive in that first 3 to 6 months when all that data was sort of coming through. Now, there is some data recently in the last 4 or 5 months that shows there's a productivity gain when you get the balance right of sort of 3 days in the office or 3 days at home, 2 days in the office. Like that balance, typically there is a sweet spot where people actually are most productive. But the idea of being remote all the time, right from the beginning, I'm like, this won't work. So it only works when you've already got established social credit. When you've got a team that know each other and like each other and trust each other. You look 12 months down the track and you've got what, 20 to 30% of that team who are new, who've never met their colleagues, who don't know you, the boss. And the problem, of course, is when we don't have a narrative as to why things are being said, why things are being done, why this decision's being made, without the narrative and the that flinch response of just assuming the best, giving the benefit of the doubt because you know the person. Without any of that, you invent your own narrative. And what is that narrative? People don't know what I need. People don't value my contribution. The boss is out to get me. And you're seeing this happen so often because when the social credit is there, it's like the mortar between the bricks doesn't exist. There's none of that relational connection. And so therefore, the leader of the team, the manager says something and everyone gets offended. They're like, I didn't even say that, but it doesn't matter. People read into it, whatever they decided the narrative was. So creating those points of connection, physically being together. I'm seeing this with like off-sites and conferences where now more of the program isn't speakers. like you'll have some speakers at an event, but a lot of the time it's just spent doing things together, building those relationships. And I think that's actually now more important than ever.
That's a really, really important point. And I know my mind went to, like, businesses, large or small turnover staff. If you looked at over a 2 or 3 year period, you could have a significant turnover, or you could have, even if it's not significant, but to induct the new people into the culture, knowing how people operate, the rhythms of the business, the leaders of the business, how you manage people. Like, there is so much now that you got to take from an induction perspective. It's more than just, come in, start, here's your contract, here's the employee handbook, go sit with Michael, he'll teach you everything you need to do. And then by next week, you'll be up and running.
Yeah. It's interesting too. The theme that comes to mind when I hear, because I think you're spot on, so much of that needs to happen by osmosis. It's like culture is caught, not taught. You can be told what the culture of a team is, but you pick it up by being around others. And I saw this really interestingly. I was working with like a big grocery brand that we'd all know, I won't name them, but they're a great business, beautiful culture as an organization. And I was speaking to leadership offsite for them, probably, when would it be? Maybe mid 2022. So we'd had a couple of the lockdowns in and out. They were based in Melbourne, so they've been in lockdown more than a lot of other places around the country. So they were coming together for this leadership sort of 2-day event, and I was speaking as part of the second day. And it was interesting watching the group. At one point we went out to a break, and you might remember this, there's a book that came out about the All Blacks years ago, and the term was something like, you got to sweep the sheds or whatever it was, or clean the dressing room, clean the change rooms, whatever the term was for that in New Zealand. So that's one of the cultural hallmarks for the All Blacks, is whenever you leave a space, you leave it cleaner than when you found it. That's the way you honor and show respect. So that's one of these. Do you know what the phrase is? I can't
remember the phrase. I'll have to Google it at some point.
It's something like sweep the sheds or whatever it is, like clean the sheds. That was the thing. Anyway, interestingly, so I noticed we went out to the break for this lunch break, and one of the head of operations said to this team, and in the team, there were probably, I would say 40 to 45% were new, had not been there before COVID, had never met their colleagues. And so the head of operations, before they went to the break, said, okay, team, you know the drill, let's sweep the sheds, or whatever the phrase is. And those who'd been around knew that means we pick up our coffee cups and the wrappers for our Mentos, and now we clean up after ourselves. We don't assume the hotel staff are going to do this when we get to a lunch break. And I watched all of the people who knew go, what the heck? What does that mean?
What does that actually mean?
Like any of us would, if you're not in that culture.
Yeah.
And then they watched, oh, that means we pick up our cups. And I noticed when we went to the afternoon break, same thing. In fact, it didn't even need to be said. No one had to say, let's sweep the sheds. Everyone at the afternoon break, even the new staff who are brand new, knew that's just what we do. We clean up after ourselves. We honor the place we're in, leave it cleaner than needed than we found it. And I watched that, and I thought, that's a moment of culture formation. You couldn't do that virtually. And you could codify that and say, our cultures are bullet points. But you pick that up by being around people. So I think those are the things, to your point, that you just need to be physically around others to get them.
One of the things you talk about also is the need to measure impact, not activity. And so the way we measure how, the performance metrics of an individual in the business, probably it's an old way of doing it, needs to be retired. But what do we replace them with?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, it depends on the industry, hey, but I think we do seem to still have a culture, if we're not careful, of bums on seats and measuring the time that you're there, time that you're working, when you clock on, when you clock off, as opposed to how effective you are, how productive you are. And I'm seeing that change in some industries. And I think one of the discussions about the 4-hour work week, not 4-hour work, 4-day work week.
4-day work week.
4-hour work week, that'd be fun.
That'd be great.
The 4-day work week, I think, is interesting, because where the chafing around that for businesses has been like, but if I'm paying you for 5, I need 5 days of work. But I thought, well, if I'm as effective in 4 as I am in 5, why not do 4-day work weeks? And what you're really dealing with there is a mentality around how we measure impact. Just because you're not working the full 5 days, does that mean the value exchange from employer to employee is any less? And I can see multiple sides of that argument, because then I think, well, if you're doing it in 4 days, how much more could you do in 5? If you're being paid for 5, do you need to be more productive? Do you need to, it's amazing how your capacity rises or limits to meet whatever the container you're in is. So if that time container is 4 days or 5 days, if suddenly it's 5 days, how about you take the same level of productivity, the same cadence and pace, and do it over 5 days, and you're adding more value to the business. I mean, if you're getting paid well to do what you do, which many people in Australia are, we get paid really good wages. Is it unreasonable for a boss to say, well, if you can do it in 4, why don't you do more? I do see the arguments going both ways, but I think those sorts of discussion points, because the data is pretty compelling, 4-day work weeks in terms of happiness, engagement, longevity in workplaces, there's a lot of benefits. And so it does come down to these very core things of how do we measure the value exchange for an organization. And I think, for the last few years, we've had a war for talent, hard to get qualified staff. And so employees could sort of call the shots. There'll be a point at which that changes.
It shifts.
It shifts. And we've got to be mindful that at that point, I think that the balance of power will shift back toward employers. And that's going to be a rude shock for a whole bunch of young people who've only ever known a world where they can call the shots and make demands. And to me, the biggest thing that I see lacking amongst some young staff, it's not all, but some, is that sense of presumption, entitlement, a fundamental lack of humility, a fundamental lack of gratitude for having a role.
A job.
Yeah, like Gen Xers were so grateful to have a job because they'd come out of economic downturn. Gen Ys were a little bit different. They had a little bit of a shoulders back presumption, like I've got something to offer the world, and that whole self-esteem thing. With Generation Z, I think we've got to be very mindful, even though they've seen a lot of uncertainty in the rest in an Aussie context, they've really not seen a tough economy. And that can't help but shape your expectations of what's fair for you, how much you deserve. And I just feel like there has to be honor both ways. We value the people we hire, but those people have to honor those who've given them a job and started the business and paved the way and paid the price to create that role. It's got to go both ways.
Yeah, really, really good point. I want to talk about relevance and how I think you argue that relevance must be earned, not assumed. In this state that we're in at the moment where everything is changing so fast.
Yep.
And particularly how we lead is changing so rapidly. In fact, I always say we're writing the new book of what leadership looks like, today. How do leaders stay relevant amongst all of this shift and change?
I would say the best quote I ever came across that really goes to the core of, I think, that question was from Alvin Toffler. So those over a certain age will remember Alvin Toffler was like the OG futurist. So back in the 70s, he wrote a book called Future Shock. One of the quotes in that book I came across a few years ago, and I thought, gosh, it is more relevant now than ever. And it's a quote where he said, "The illiterate of the future will not be those who can't read and write. It'll be those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn." And I think from a relevant standpoint for leaders, it's that unlearning piece, being open-minded, not holding on to what we know and what we think what feels certain or secure or definite because it's always been that way. Because the term intellectual humility, I think, is a useful term to use, and how important that is for any leader to stay very open-minded and not too rigid in their thinking, because the world is changing so rapidly around us. Being stubborn or fixed in our thinking is such a dangerous trap for any of us today, because if you're not careful, it's like, the moment you think you've made it, you've passed it.
Yeah.
If you think you've arrived at the winning formula for the best way to lead this team and run this business and succeed in this industry, the levers we have to pull, the buttons we have to press to get results, and we just assume it's always going to fundamentally be that way, that's dangerous because the landscape is changing so rapidly around us.
Yeah. And leading to that, let's talk about the change piece.
Yeah.
How adaptable are people to all the change that's happening around them right now?
Well, I think certainly there is a level of change fatigue. I do see that people are just like, I'm a bit tired. I'm tired of constantly having to shift the way I do things and change and adapt, and see it all as really good, because there is that sense of like, I'm just a bit over it. I get that. I think we all sort of feel that in a way. But I think if you look at the neuroscience behind why people push back and why they resist, and that's been the real focus. I think probably it would be 8 or 9 years ago, that was the focus shift for me, was away from just what the changes themselves look like to essentially looking at the question of, why don't smart people change? Why do people resist change? Even when the evidence is so clear they need to, and they can see all the benefits, what causes us so often to have that reflex of pushing back and resisting change? And there's no great surprise that the emotion that underpins that sense of stubbornness or resistance is fear. But fear plays out in a way that might surprise you. It certainly surprised me when I came across this stuff. And we've only really learned this in the last 15 to 20 years from a neuroscience standpoint, because we've assumed the fear that causes people to be stubborn is the fear of change. That's not true. So you and I, we're not actually afraid of change. What we're afraid of, and this is the key distinction that for leaders to get our heads around this and really identify what the pushback points are, it's the fear of loss that causes us not to change, not the fear of change itself. And so the three losses we've got to be hyper aware of that cause people to not change, or also cause us not to change, even when exposed to super clear evidence that we ought to, and it would benefit us to change. The three losses, the number one is the loss of power. That idea that if I change, I might lose some of the power that I once had. The second is a loss of dignity, which is massive. That sense of I might be embarrassed because I might be out of my depth. I may not know all the answers. And for those who've got their identity, their self-worth based on the fact that they always know the answers, that loss of dignity can be huge. And I saw this one play out recently. I was chatting with a colleague who does AI implementations with large financial services companies. And he said he notices when he goes in to speak to a C-suite team, he'll talk about all the AI that they can use and what it could save them time and energy-wise. The first response of the C-suite is to go, "This is unreal." Second response is to look at the CTO and say, "How come you didn't tell us this?" And in that moment, he said what he notices is the biggest blocker to the things he's suggesting or proposing is not the chief risk officer, the CEO or the CIO, it's the CTO. The person he would think would be most open to the tech is the person who's most resistant. They will sabotage the process, white ant what he's putting forward because they've been embarrassed. They've had their dignity affronted in front of their colleagues. They've lost face. So a loss of power, the loss of dignity. The third one is big, and that loss is the loss of certainty. And as humans, we'll opt for unhappiness over uncertainty. Now, we'll stick with jobs and ways of doing things, even relationships that aren't serving us, that suck, but like we know it. The devil you know is better than the one you don't, and so we'll stick with them. And so for leaders, and the challenge isn't how do you try and sell the benefits of change? And that's typically where we start. We pile all the benefits of the change on trying to sell it. What you'd be far smarter to do is to lessen the loss. How do you reduce the sense of the loss associated with change? And you'll find your people will be far more open to it, far more wholehearted, whole-minded in being willing to consider what you're suggesting.
Well, that's just made me think that the whole change process that we've written so many books about and training on needs just to be thrown out the window and start
Really,
again, Michael.
There's so much of that, but there is, isn't there? There's things that it becomes like a truism, this orthodoxy that's so established, we assume it's the case. But again, we've got to consistently update our assumptions and realize that what worked 30 years ago, 50 years ago, in terms of the levers you could pull to try and change people, in an age where people are exhausted, overwhelmed, and distrusting, those things don't work the way they used to. And yet we still tend to use the same techniques, the same practices, and wonder why it feels like bashing our head up against a brick wall.
So if you were then, linking into that, looking at the attributes a leader really needs to take an organization through change, whether it's including new AI, 4-day work week, whatever we're looking at, what are some of the key attributes a leader needs to have today to take that business forward then?
I think the first one will be, if you want to try, I guess, lessen that sense of loss associated with the change, I would say the first thing is start with making the change feel familiar. So in other words, make it feel like an extension of the past. Like we're already doing this. It's just this is a slight tweak, just a way to slightly do what we've always done, but slightly better, as opposed to something entirely new. So the more you can make change feel familiar, the more open people will be to it. And so great examples of that. So the whole AI thing is interesting now because in many ways, it's analogous to what we saw happen back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, when James Watt invented and revolutionized the steam turbine engine, there was massive fear, huge pushback for all the same reasons we're seeing right now around AI. Now, his genius move that got people to be somewhat open to these new steam turbine engines he'd invented was to use a frame of reference that was familiar. So, for instance, he talked about them in terms of their horsepower. Now you wonder, why do we, a SpaceX rocket goes into space with 300,000 horsepower? What a stupid number to use. Why do we refer to things as horsepower? It goes back to James Watt, because when he was trying to sell the idea of this, people are like, okay, well, I've only got 1 horse, but this machine's 8 horsepower. Like that, okay, cool. It freaks me out a bit, but at least I'm open to it because I can see it's a frame of reference I see as familiar and valuable. I can make sense of that. And so in schools, when I'm working with schools, I'll say, well, and we're with teachers, I'll say, okay, AI in the classroom freaks a lot of teachers out right now. I do a lot of work in education around policy and classroom practice. And I love working with educators, even though it's not my core business. I really love working with educators. I'm from a long line of teachers. And so what I'll say to teachers is think of it a little bit like the pocket calculator. You still need to learn the basic skills before you're given a calculator. But then once you've got the calculator, it allows you to take those basic bits of knowledge and extend them further. AI in the classroom is a little bit the same. You can't take out the early stages of learning the basics and the fundamentals. But if you can then overlay AI on top, it becomes a brilliant tool for leveraging your skills. Or it's, the example I'll use is going from a typewriter to a word processor. There'd be people who, they love their typewriters. That's the way you should write a document. And we get out the liquid paper and we retype things if we make a mistake and the thing gets jammed. And there are people who said, I don't want to use a word processor because it feels like cheating. And in many ways, that's analogous to what we're seeing happen with AI. I was chatting with a young lawyer a few weeks ago, and she said, I don't use any AI. It was like a badge of honor for her. So I just, as a lawyer, I think it's really important I just do all the work myself. I'm like, that's great, but it's a little bit like the word processor versus typewriter. I said, you're probably going to have to update that mindset in the next 6 months, or you'll just find you're not relevant. And so I think that's the first thing, is how do you make those changes feel familiar? The second is to give people a sense of choice or agency in the process of change. You give them like a couple of options, say, which one do you like best? And it's amazing how there's a great book called The Catalyst by Jonah Berger, brilliant book that looks at this question of how do you lead people through the process of change by giving them a sense of agency or choice. Because he said, if you give someone 3 or 4 choices, they start to shift their mindset from why they don't want to do what you're suggesting to which of the things you've put forward they like best.
Right.
And for so often as humans, the moment we feel like we don't have agency or choice, we're in the driver's seat, we'll push back and we'll resist things, even if deep down we know they're a really good idea, but because we didn't feel like it was our idea. And so as a leader, how do you give agency and choice as well?
Just while you were talking, I'm just thinking the skill sets from a leader's perspective. We've gone from, you must be really good at doing the, reading a P&L, letting HR do their job. Your job is to communicate. And that was at one point in time, the most important role a leader had was you had to be a great communicator. But now we need to be able to influence. We need to be able to create emotional safety, a trusted environment, be really practical, lead minds through, as you said in the beginning, through your heart more than through that piece of paper. That's a real shift, isn't it, from where we were 2, 3, 4 years ago?
Yep. And what's interesting is in many ways it allows you to relax a bit if you do it well. Like, it's truly, I was speaking at a conference recently for a big retail chain, and the CEO at the beginning stood up and said, he was only new to the role. And he said the biggest shift he's seen in his time of being an executive leader, he says that I don't need to be the expert anymore. In fact, I need to not be the expert, because if I'm the expert in the team, I'm the greatest limiting factor around how fast we can change and adapt. He said, I need to essentially be like the conductor of an orchestra of different people with different ideas, and I'll make decisions at some point. But at the end of the day, my job is not to be the person that makes the call, the hero at the top of the mountain. That's a mentality we've had for years. Yet I think the challenge is we then talk about we want people to have a growth mindset and challenge their thinking and ask questions and speak up and have divergent views. That starts at the top. And so unless the leader has a growth mindset and acknowledges they don't know everything, and to sit comfortably with not knowing and to signal that to people around you, you won't get the best ideas out of your people. I heard this great insight from Andy Stanley, who's a leadership expert in the States. And he said, leaders who don't listen will eventually be surrounded by people who've got nothing to say. And I think, you so often see that the leader who isn't open-minded, feels they need to know everything or pretend they know everything, it signals to everyone else in the team, that's the culture that we value here. Cover your backside, don't make a mistake, don't share a view that might be uncomfortable, and always pretend you've got all the answers. And that's just not a recipe for good thinking in a modern environment where things are changing so fast.
I want to refer back to the article that you wrote on LinkedIn, which is when I reached out to you, which was Forget Perks and Ping Pong. Because what you're talking about here is a massive cultural shift. In organizations led by the person at the top. And you actually wrote an article, you challenge shallow culture initiatives. Talk to me more about that.
I think sometimes we have this notion that if we just put a ping pong table in, or we make it look and feel a bit like Google does, and that was the benchmark, wasn't it?
Well, it was, wasn't it? We all wanted a ping pong table because Google had it.
And so you can have those things and they're fun, but if that's what you're expecting to change the culture, it's it's a band-aid type solution. And there is a sense in which it creates a level of cynicism, because people feel like they're being treated like a child. This idea, we're going to entertain you and make you feel happy, but actually at the end of the day, we also want you to act like a child, do as you're told, be seen and not heard. And so, that tends to mean you don't get a culture where people have, what we often talk about, psychological safety, the ability to speak up, to challenge authority, to bring their best ideas and their best selves to the table. And so I think that's the thing for many of us, is how to create that sort of a culture. And again, that's got to start at the top. That is scary for a lot of leaders, because it means stepping aside from that role of I'm in control, I've got the power, I've got all the answers, I'm unassailable. And so I think for a lot of leaders that can feel like you're going to lose control if you do that. And there are times when you need to make a call, you need to be definitive. I think the 3 things, and I'm working on a new book at the moment, it's only last week looking I was thinking of a Venn diagram of what are the things required to be. And funnily enough, even when you sent through the notes for this podcast, the term I wrote down was a future fit leader. Like, what are the mindsets required to be future fit? And so the 3 sort of Venn diagrams, concentric circles, it was confidence. So knowing how to back yourself. No one wants a leader who steps back and is tentative and unsure. There's a level of which confidence engenders support and enthusiasm and also security. When people know their leader is confident, it's like when you're in a household where the parent sets boundaries, everyone can relax a bit. They're not harsh, they're not mean, but this is what we're about. This is who we are. This is where we're going. And so I think having confidence is important. The second is conviction, like knowing what you stand for and what you don't. And I think the idea for leaders who are willing to just go with the breeze, whatever's happening this week, this month. I mean, that creates a very weak culture in an organization. So I think certainly confidence and conviction. The last one though is curiosity, which is being willing to ask questions. And sort of the metaphor I often use is shifting from expert to explorer. And my wife and I and our little one went out into the Central Australia last year, and it was interesting going to a couple of these towns, and there'd be plaques for these adventurers would have set out from a big city, often Melbourne, sometimes Sydney, and they go out to unlock Central Australia. Very harsh, unfamiliar environment, obviously very, very dry, very, very confronting as an environment to go into. The explorers who prevailed, the ones who got out there, and they'd done the research. They knew what to do. They prepared, they'd packed, they'd had experience doing this before, but they went out with their eyes open. This idea of, okay, we don't know this is new. We're going to have to ask people who know this environment what to do here. So they asked the local Indigenous tribes. They learned from them. They listened to them. They had the humility to be curious and open. And I think that explorer mindset, as opposed to the expert that goes out and say, well, we've done this before, we know all the answers. They were the exploration teams that looked down on the locals, the Indigenous population, and said, oh, what would they know? And they thought they knew best. And they typically starved or died in the wilderness because that sense of we've got all the answers. So I think explorer versus expert is probably a good way to think about this as we get into the future of, are you being an explorer or an expert? Because experts look to defend. They want to have power. They want to have answers.
So true.
And they've got a track record that they want to stand by or stand on. Explorers go in prepared, thoughtful, but eyes open, eyes up, humble, willing to reconsider.
That is a great way for us to segue into the 4 questions we ask all of our guests. And I think you might have answered the first, but we'll repeat it if we need to. If you had to describe a future fit leader in just 3 words, the kind of leader we'll need the most in the years ahead, what would they be and why? And you've just said those.
I think so, yes. And if we look at the 3 intersecting circles, we've got, conviction, confidence, curiosity. If you look at those, I mean, like any good Venn diagram, in the middle where you got the sweet spot of all 3 of them overlapping, that's a future fit leader. That's the explorer mindset. But if you just take 2 of them, like if you're confident, in fact, I wrote this down, so I'll read it so I don't get it wrong. Conviction and confidence without curiosity makes you dogmatic. That idea, you've got all the answers and you know how things are. Curiosity and confidence without conviction. So I'm open and I know what I'm about, but I don't know what I stand for, makes you a chameleon. And you see leaders who just can go with the breeze, everything that happens, what do we stand for this month? And that idea that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything makes you a very weak leader and it makes a weak culture. And then curiosity and conviction, but without confidence. Those leaders who know what they're about and they're really curious, but they don't have the confidence to actually make a decision and stick with it. They become the overthinkers who are constantly trying to get more data until they make a call at some point. You need to do that. So I think that's the thing. If you can get all 3 in balance, that's that explorer mindset, which is what we need to have for the years ahead.
I'll ask a question on that. I don't normally do this, but I will this time, because I 100% agree with you. And that's one of the reasons why I started this podcast and called it Future Fit Leader, because I think, when we listen to more and more people, it allows us to be curious about how the world of leadership is changing. But if I'm a leader listening to this today and go, okay, how do I make sure that I have all of those 3 areas working correctly and in sync so I have the explorer mindset? What would your advice be?
I think the one that for leaders, they probably will struggle with the most, and I think is the most confronting for a lot of us in a modern environment, particularly as you get older. And you look at the brain science behind this. As we get older, our brains love efficiency. They love to be lazy. And so neural synapses get pruned away that we don't use. And so typically you become more and more certain about what you do like, what you want to eat, where you want to go, how you travel to work, who you spend time with.
True. Happens when you get older.
All of us do. And really, it starts to happen from your late 20s into your early 30s. So it happens relatively young. And so I think the one of all of those that leaders would struggle with, confidence can be one that's perennial challenge. Is how do you own your space and know what you're about? I see for Gender plays into this in a big way. I was chatting with someone recently, and her main focus is working with executive women who still are plagued with imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
That idea of, I don't want to own my space and stand up. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done for some leaders around confidence. Conviction, I think we've talked a lot about values of leadership over the years, so that's important. So those two, I think people are most familiar with in terms of this. There's good resources out there to build those two. It's the curiosity. Which I find interesting. I finished reading a book last night by Martha Beck. And Martha Beck is one of Oprah's therapists, and her main area is around anxiety. So the book is called Beyond Anxiety, which was interesting because even as I was reading it, anxiety is something I've never really struggled with, but I find it interesting because when I know friends and close family who do, it's always intrigued me why it has no rational basis. So I read this book through the lens of trying to understand this from a research standpoint, but also to try and just be of use to people in my world. But so much of the book is how do we unlock the anxious spiral response and shift out of an anxious spiral into a curious spiral. And so it's a great book. It only came out a few months ago, but she gives some really practical ideas and advice. But when you have that response of wanting to shut down and get defensive and fearful of change and new things and new ideas and new perspectives and uncertainty, how do you not go down the anxiety spiral, but go into a curiosity spiral? And so much of it's about deliberately forcing yourself to do unfamiliar things, play, have fun, do things that are essentially like what you did when you were a kid. What are kids? Kids are scientists. They're full of wonder. They're naturally curious. And so it's actually forcing your brain to get comfortable with being exposed to new things and novelty. And there's something about that that literally rewires the way your brain works and means that it's almost like the way I describe it is microdosing uncertainty, because you're getting used to being in uncertain places. So my little experiment, I've been doing this all year as I've been writing this book, is every week I do a thing called an indie experiment. So indie stands for I'd never do it. Right. I learned this from a colleague of mine who started doing this a few years ago. And so the idea behind it is that you do an activity that you would never normally engage with. So you read a book you wouldn't read, listen to a podcast you wouldn't listen to, order something on the menu you wouldn't normally order. And every week I do something. And I do a little, I keep a record of what I do, what it demanded of me, how it felt, what I learned from the process. And what I'm looking to do at the end of the year is actually measure how much more my tolerance for uncertainty has grown as a result of microdosing unfamiliarity and uncertainty. And so even though I'm just doing this as my own little experiment, the data around this that's been done more broadly is really compelling. Forcing yourself into novel circumstances in unfamiliar contexts basically communicates to your brain that uncertainty isn't something to freak out about. And getting comfortable with uncertainty and things that are vague and nuanced is so important for all of us, especially for leaders.
Well, when that book is out, you have to let us know, Michael, so we can talk about that.
I will.
But let's go to the next question, which is, what's one future shift coming in the next few years that you think most leaders are underestimating or not prepared for?
Yeah, so I guess if we circle back to AI, that's the big one. The thing that's being, I think, underestimated right now is the impact on confidence. And we talked about confidence before, but I don't mean in a leadership sense, but certainty. So I should say convenience when it comes to the cost of confidence is a dangerous thing. And I'm noticing in my clients and even in myself, I wrote a blog post about this a few weeks ago, how much using these tools are making me lazy. And it's making me question whether I can do it now without ChatGPT. So the analogy I would use is the last few cars we've owned have got cameras and sensors and the above roof thing. What I notice is that now when I get into a hire car,
and it doesn't have it.
Truly, like one of those base model Camrys or whatever. And I'm like, it might have a sensor on the back, but that's it. I'm like, I've become a rubbish parker. I used to be really good at parking. Yeah. So I could get straight into a parking spot, no issues. I've lost my skills. And I notice that when I get into a car where I don't have that, I notice that now if I get on a long flight and there's not Wi-Fi on the plane and I plan to do a whole bunch of work, schedule some things, write some ideas, work on a section of a book. If I haven't got ChatGPT there, I genuinely go, I'll just wait. I'll wait till I land, wait till I get Wi-Fi again. It's almost like that. Can I still do it without AI? And I've written 10 books. There's no reason for me to step back and shrink back from the challenge of being creative, but it becomes a crutch really fast. And so I think for leaders, the more we have our teams using these tools, even though there's some fantastic gains and benefits, at what point do we not just have the skills atrophy, but the confidence that we have skills that we can use? What point did that atrophy? To me, that is something to watch really closely in the coming couple of years.
Well, probably leads into the next question, which is, well, it does, but I'm interested in your answer, is what do you wish more leaders were paying closer attention to?
Oh gosh, there's so many things I guess that would
Yeah.
be relevant or pertinent to have front of mind. One of the things that we haven't talked a lot about is the generational change
Mm,
piece. Like that new generation of leaders coming through. Now, we talked about them a little bit, that idea of them not necessarily wanting to move into leadership, but I think more of the nuances with Gen Z that I think are important to get our heads around. The way that you manage and lead them needs to be a bit different. Like I read an article in the Wall Street Journal a little while back. It talked about the importance of not using anxiety-inducing language with Gen Z. And so, for instance, and I had to suppress an eye roll personally as a millennial when I read this. It said you can't use the word feedback. Feedback's too harsh.
what are you supposed to use then?
So you'll love this. The word is feed forward is now the word that is recommended because it's more aspirational and like positive and future facing. I was reading some research a little while back. 40% of Gen Z say they'd like to receive praise from their boss 3 times a week, if that's okay. And a lot of my clients who are Gen X is like, are you serious? Like once a year is heaps, like at the Christmas party, just do your job. Like
Yes.
very different mentality. And so like this generation have come through schools where every runner in the race gets a ribbon, like that whole focus on
That's
extrinsic
true.
praise. And it's conditioned them and to be looking for those signals. Am I on track? Am I okay? Am I doing a good job? And so from a leadership standpoint, how do you work with that? Because you can go, oh, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to give, I'm going to pander them. How stupid. And you'll typically not get the best from them. And so the
Mm.
challenge then is how do you lead this group well? So I think that's a lot of what I'm finding with clients is very relevant right now.
It's a big price to pay when everybody in the school ground wins something, isn't it, really, in
That's
the
right.
workplace?
Yeah.
What are the possibilities or shifts you see in the future of leadership or work that genuinely excites you, and why?
I think it is that shift we talked about, of going from feeling you have to be the expert to being an explorer. Being an
Mm,
explorer, that sense of being wonder-led, what a way to live.
mm,
What a better way to live. So I think for leaders, I think there can be something really fantastic about that if we actually realize that there are some skills that are those right brain, creative, wonder-filled skills as opposed to being analytical. And in an age where AI does the analytical stuff really well, that's actually the premium. That's the stuff
mm.
that'll set you apart, those sort of skills. And so I think that allows you to just rest into just being your full self and building parts of you that aren't the analytical, hyper-focused A-type, getting results type person. That can be there, but also how do you make space for play and fun and curiosity? Those are the things that often will give us the edge.
My last one is, if you could embed one leadership quality into every current or future CEO, something you believe will be essential in the next decade,
Yeah.
what would it be and why?
I think humility would have to be it. I read a book last week called Humble. Can't think of the name of the author now. And it was a whole book about humility. And it was just so refreshing because it looked at how important that is as a cultural hallmark, but also a temperament style to have. And humility is not thinking of yourself less, it's thinking less about yourself. It's
Mm.
being far more focused on others. And what that does in bringing the best out of other people around you, and also means that you're in a constant learning posture, being able to take on things you otherwise might not have learned. Yeah, that book, I can't think of the author now, but it's just called Humble. And it was a really good book. And I do think that's the trait that I would say for any of us. How do we maintain humility? Because it's tricky, particularly when you move into leadership and everyone's saying how brilliant you are and singing your praises, making allowances for you and carrying favor. How do you maintain that posture of humility?
Then there would be a connection between humility and curiosity.
Definitely. Yeah, that sense of
Yeah,
being open-minded. Yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. Michael, thank you so much for joining us on
You're
Future Fit
welcome.
Leadership. It's been lovely to reconnect and have a conversation
Right.
with you. Now, if people wanted to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So website for me is michaelmcqueen.net, and I'm on all the social platforms. So the main one I tend to post to most frequently is LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look for me on LinkedIn, I'm posting every morning, 8:45 a.m. I do a daily update. And that's whatever I've seen come through in the last 24 hours, especially technology announcements, any new data, new research that's just landed. So if you want to stay on top of a lot of this stuff, that'd be a good place to look. And on the website too, you'll find some details of the book that came out most recently that really delves into that psychology of stubbornness materials. The book is called Mind Stuck.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about the art of changing minds. How do you bring people on the journey of change and persuade them to be more open to new things? So if some of that's been useful for listeners, that's probably worth getting a copy of, just to really dig into some of the research around practical stuff that works when you deal with that sense of resistance to change.
And when's your new book coming out?
I don't know. So I'd love to have it written by October, November, then probably 12 months from there. Typically,
Right.
publishing things about a year. So I would say mid to late 2026 would be my guess.
Well, we'll all keep an eye out for it. Michael, thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast, and don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.